little broadly about what is reading comprehension.
Okay, so that's very broad.
Yeah.
So reading comprehension is not just answering WH questions, even though all the kids at school have to learn how to answer WH questions about the stories. But what goes into reading comprehension is not just being able to answer the what and who questions and get the details and the plot, but it's also understanding what is not written. It is also associating, so that it's also associating what is written in the book to the things that you already know. So that's the schema. It is how people work, how people understand each other, taking the perspective of another person, theory of mind for fiction particularly, but also for informational text to put it into a context. So it's a complicated issue. It's not just one thing. And because of the language issues that very many of the children with hyperlexia have, they very often have difficulty with this. And so sometimes if you look in the literature, they think that hyperlexia is word calling, it's decoding, but that's not really what it is, because the kids do understand what they're reading as well as they understand language. But since language is compromised, then the reading comprehension is also compromised, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Does that do it, Ciara?
Yeah. I didn't know if you'd want to go into kind of these evidence-based strategies that you've read about from the National Reading Panel.
Right. So the book that I wrote, or the kit, Hyperlexia comprehension kit that I wrote was based on the National Reading Panel meta-analysis of the literature. And this was back in 2000, so it's already 20 years old, but it's really, there's really nothing brand new since that time. And so what I did in that book was take the evidence-based strategies that the National Reading Panel found to enhance reading comprehension and adapt it to the children who learn language differently and who are also hyperlexic. And so that's the list that you're seeing now. And Ciara, should I just go through and tell you what each of those things are now, or should we?
I think that makes sense, and we can build our audience's schema now for when we refer to it later on throughout the presentation.
Okay, so we're building schema, guys. That's what we're doing right now. Okay, so this is the background information that you need. So priming is the first thing. So in priming, what they mean by priming is to talk about what you already, what is going to happen in the story. You can look at it. And if there's pictures, there can be pictures, or there can be a little discussion about the topics that may come up in the story. And then the second thing is vocabulary, because there may be new vocabulary to the that's particular for the story or the information. And I think I say this over and over again, but I don't understand all the vocabulary that my husband uses when he talks about physics. And so very often I have to he has to explain to me what he means by particular words. And so we all are constantly learning new vocabulary. And the language changes. And so there's a lot of new vocabulary now that we haven't used in the past. And there's old vocabulary that some stories have that are not usually used in common everyday speech. So that's why vocabulary is very important. And then, so there's definitions. Vocabulary can be associating with visual things, or you can actually define words in other words that would make it more understandable to the child. And then we're talking about accessing prior knowledge. What do you know about this situation? The first story that um, is in the green book that I was talking about is about a girl that loves trains, and it's put in there because many of the children that we work with love trains, and so they know a lot about trains, but they may not know that uh, that a rail car might be called a coach, and so they may, and so yeah, Ciara's putting up some of the screenshots of the way that we teach those, and in the book I've included cardboard phrase strips, and so you could see that there's lines for that to be put in and used as a multiple choice kind of thing. And all these things happen before you actually read the story. So then, you have a lot of steps that go before reading the story, and then you read the story and make some comments about the story and fill in some of the things that are not written actually on the page. And then if it's a short story, we can summarize what happened in the story. And in the book, I also have phrase strips that you can use for summarizing that, but also if it's a long story for older kids, you can summarize what was on the page or what was in the chapter, sort of like Cliff Notes. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember Cliff Notes, which is, short stories about complicated works of mostly fiction, and you can make a template sort of what happened in each chapter. So, and then the analysis, that's finally when the questions come. Okay, so that's finally where you talk about the main idea and what was this story about, and then you can have an answer to that, and then where was the story set. In the first book, well, they visited a train station. Okay, so that was one of the things. And who are the characters in the story? So it's the WH questions, and then what happened in the story. And then many stories have a problem and a solution. So what was the problem? What was going on, and how was it solved? And in the second part of the story in the book, the little girl left her bag of trains on the train station, and as the train pulled out, she saw them little lying on the bench, and what was she going to do? So that was a problem and a solution. Not all stories have that, but many do. It adds to the tension in the story. And so then there's higher level questions and higher level analysis that deal with reading between the lines and what was not stated and what do you think is going to happen and why did the characters react in the way that they did, and all those higher level abstract questions is the higher level analysis. And then we talked about visualizing, and there's a place in the book to draw a picture about the story, your own picture about the story. And then later on, we'll talk a little bit about pronoun references, and there was a question about this and that. And so there's a little exercise about that because it can be very confusing to kids. So that's my quick and dirty summary of what we base it on. But on the other hand, there's much more to it than that. So now we hope to talk about that some more.
I think too, I just want to give some quick context for the rest of our answers. So we get a lot of questions about, well, how do I teach it to a middle school age kiddo or a high school age kiddo? And I think just the way that we think about it as therapists is not really based on age. It's based on their ability level, what they're interested in, what's going to grab their attention. And then we're just going to scaffold all of our skills based on where they're at. So it doesn't necessarily matter the age. All of the strategies we're discussing today can be applied to whatever age, and then just kind of modified according to their skill level.
Yeah, I think we describe it usually as like a hierarchy of skills, and you're meeting your child wherever they're at and helping supporting them to get to that next level in the hierarchy. And so regardless if they're, in third grade or they're 13, you're kind of meeting them at that where they are in the hierarchy. And depending on the book and the situation, they may be at different levels of that hierarchy, because if it's a book that they're really on a topic they're really interested and familiar with, they may have so much background knowledge that they can handle those levels that are much more complex on that subject matter. If it's a book about something that they've never heard of before or just like haven't had any experience, even though if it's a simpler book, they still may be at a higher level in the hierarchy just because of that lack of familiarity. So it isn't a given age, and it isn't just once I'm at this, once I've met this, I've mastered this. You're going to change where you are in that hierarchy with every new reading experience you have.
Absolutely. Very well said, Sarah.
I think kind of going in to dive more deep then. So at the beginning of that, we kind of talk about that building that schema and that background knowledge. So what are some like specific activities you can do to help build schema and background knowledge for a kid when you're introducing a reading text that they're unfamiliar with?
Okay, so some of the things you can do are experiences, but what kids often get from, our kids particularly often get from the experience what you anticipated. So I can't tell you how many times the kids have gone to visit Disney if it ever opens again. And what they were most interested in were the numbers on the hotel doors. So it's trying to help the kids have experiences that they can build on. But also we have to understand who they are and what they're really interested in, and try to draw them into something that would expand what they're interested in. And Ciara, do you have some ideas on that?
Yeah, I think you really helped clarify some things when we were chatting last week about when we were talking about visualizing and being able to have background knowledge, is that I feel like a lot of typical learners and neurotypical readers will be able to kind of build background knowledge based on how things are described in the story. And that's kind of the opposite of our hyperlexic kiddos. And so quite often schools and academics are demanding them to be able to just visualize, just picture it, right? Like that's your background knowledge. And our kiddos can't do that. And so just making sure that we're giving them the visuals first, because that's how they're building that background knowledge in that schema. So if there's a new vocabulary word or a new concept, let's watch the movie first. Let's look at the pictures first. Let's build that first so that when they're reading, they can then attach new meaning to it.
Yeah, I think visualizing is a hard thing to describe sometimes. I know the first time we talk about it a lot in our literacy program, and the first, I've had a kiddo and it's like, close your eyes and picture this. What do you see? Black. And they're very literal. Like, that's what I see. I see is black. And so I think you really have to be able to break it down, and it's to describe like, okay, so we're trying to picture this character, like what, color hair does he have? What, like, you have to ask really specific questions to kind of help build that picture. because it is a more challenging skill than it may be for your neurotypical kid.
Mhm.
You know, as the kids get a little bit older, they're reading books that don't have illustrations that go right with them. And so I remember one of the kids was reading, the second grade teacher was reading to them, Sara Plain and Tall. And not this Sarah, but a Sarah.
I'm very
But
sure.
but I'm sure this kid, if they knew Sarah, would think that this is Sarah. And so the child just couldn't um, make the transition into a Sarah that lived at a different time, that wore different clothes. But fortunately, there was a little video of that book. And so once he said, oh, that's what Sarah looks like. That's what Sarah, that's where Sarah lives. Could not get the description, get the picture from the word description. And so that's a very important point.
I'm hoping that we can get through all of our questions and into more of the school focus. But just in case we can't, I want to make a quick comment that makes this functional to our audience, is that if the student is given a new book at school or a new passage, what you can do as parents or teachers or with modifications in their IEP is have it be that you're pre-teaching vocabulary, that you're giving visuals for them to connect new concepts to. That's kind of a first step to building the reading comprehension, is making sure that background's there. And so those are some modifications you should be making as a first step.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I think we can go on to the next one. So a big question that we got is about what are some natural ways and kind of to check in for comprehension when you're reading a passage that maybe, you know, a little bit longer, like how frequently do you check in? Like when is a natural time to check in? What does that look like?
Okay, so one of the things that I have learned through the years is that one of the ways you check in is asking the child to tell you what they think they heard, or tell you about something, or at the end of a session to go tell mom or dad, or tell their brother and sister what they've learned about. And so it's very interesting because many times you realize that what they paid attention to were the details and not the big picture. And so very often they will give, you know, what they got from it was the detail. And that was a eye-opening thing to me, to hear them talk back about the book. And so then we could go back and say, okay, let's put this in a bigger context, and what is it really about? So
I think that this question too just depends on your kiddo's ability, and you'll kind of get used to it yourself, or a professional will be able to guide you on if you need to be, you know, checking every page or checking at the end of a whole entire book, or maybe checking at the end of a chapter. I think you'll kind of be able to gauge that and maybe start with the smallest increment. So, you know, when you're reading a new book, check after a couple pages. If he's got it, nailed it, okay, then maybe you can check after a whole book the next time. Or for, you know, some of our higher level chapter book reads, start after, you know, midway through a chapter. If he's struggling with that point, then make it even smaller increments. And then again, I think that, I mean, even a typical reader, you're not going to be getting every little piece. So be also forgiving and understanding that there's a lot of details, but I think it's very individualized on when to be stopping and checking for that comprehension.
mhm.
I think so too, and part of, I might be jumping ahead of ourselves, but we talked a little bit about that story retell. And so something that I actually like to do, and Sarah's brought up as well, is kind of creating comics. And so you can both be retelling the story, either they're verbally telling it to you, they might be writing it down, you might be writing it down after they dictate, or maybe they want to make their own comic. You can do that online, which I'll show you in a little bit. They can act it out, which could be a fun retell activity. So there's a lot of different ways too to get that retell piece down.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think the written summaries for different pieces is something that's really common. I've done to make it more exciting, especially for middle school students these days. I think, when I first started, I asked kids what they wanted to be. They wanted to be a doctor or a policeman when they grew up. Now half of them want to be YouTubers. So I've asked them, I'll like, okay, I'm going to record you like you're a YouTuber telling me about this. And it's very relevant. So I think it's get some good buy-in. But it's that retell piece is really difficult. And so you may need to scaffold that with some written questions and written prompts. So you can use those closed sentences to help with the summary. You could kind of go back and forth with some of those skills. So this is related but a little different in regards to something comprehension with something like math problems, which people don't normally associate with like reading comprehension, but word problems really are about reading comprehension as much as it is to do with the math. So what are some ways you can support that?
Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. I do get this question a lot, actually, and I think just making it as visual as possible. So let me actually just share my screen and maybe we can do this quickly. You guys will have to excuse my sloppy writing. But so say, Johnny has 3 apples and Susan has 7 bananas and they need more fruit. I think just making that visual, both writing it down. So Johnny has 3. I would also kind of depict it with having my oranges, with having my bananas. You guys, I'm being fast and not waste time. I apologize. And then also just kind of writing out how we should be thinking about this. So I need to add, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need to be scaffolding that out. What is the question even asking? Because a lot of the time they're not using like, you need to add these. That's not the word problem. You have to figure out. And so a lot of times when you're learning word problems, the teachers will give you the words to be looking for that make you think of, adding and subtracting. And so I like to make a little chart that has these words mean to add, these words mean to subtract, these words mean to divide and multiply, and then just kind of showing that out and providing more of a consistent script on how to take the information from the math problem and apply it into a visual written word problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
So like we've talked a lot about, making schedules. You could kind of make your almost like, here's my to-do list to solve a math problem. 1, look for keywords. 2, decide which computation I'm doing. 3, do the computation. So you can make yourself your to-do list. Right. That a lot of our kids are really good at following for those word problems. And then, that to-do list will change and modify as the type of math, changes as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, also these kids are very often pattern learners. And so they often need a lot of examples of a particular pattern. The adding pattern, the subtracting, as it gets very much more difficult when they have to do several processes within one word problem. But giving them not just one, or not just a few of a pattern, but to give them lots of that same pattern, so then they can have that pattern in their mind and then go to another one. The math programs now are very different than the ones that we did when I was in school eons ago. And at that time, we didn't think so much about math problems. Now the math programs want kids to think and create different ways of solving the problem. But our kids very often need to see those different ways before they can actually think of them. And so math comprehension, which is reading comprehension for word problems, is also a pattern of learning thing. So.
Yeah, I think especially math is just like practice when in order to build that pattern.
So there is a question, Phyllis, that came up in our Q&A. Thank you guys for posing that. And we're actually going to get to it later when we talk about anaphora. But the question, Phyllis, is if each bucket has 3 apples and there are 4 buckets, my son thinks there are only 3 apples because they've labeled one as each. And so just teaching what that, I'm not sure if that's a pronoun or what that is, but what that piece of speech is referring to. So I think we'll get to that a little later, but that is a great question. The other question again is like the what age would children begin answering these? And I think when the school starts to provide those questions, I think it's almost, I'm scared to say this, I think it's as early as kindergarten that kids are working on word problems now. I think one, be fair and realistic with your child, but also it's just based on their level. I can't say that, you know, all 6-year-olds should be doing this. It's based on whatever their language comprehension is.
Yeah. So yes, language, the English language and language in general is complicated. And so very often we're using pronouns or other parts of speech to refer to things that and that may not be clear to our children, you know. So if we're saying, what is that? They have to know that there's something that they're looking at, or there's something that that they read about, and that would refer to that. And so the language gets pretty difficult to comprehend, because we're not always using the nouns and easy verbs. I mean, our kids are wonderful at learning nouns, and have the 2-year-olds know all the shapes and all the colors, and they may be actually calculating numbers without knowing what they have already done. It's not in language to them, it's a pattern. And so then when the sentences get more complex, either in a book or in problems, this becomes a little bit of a problem for them. And so we have to scale back and write the sentence and then fill in what the referent is. And so
I don't know why I thought of a green armadillo, but it is just referring to the green armadillo. So I would even draw out something like this on the whiteboard that I have next to me, or the paper, drawing that it is the green armadillo. And then you're going to rewrite the sentence, want to see the green armadillo, instead of it, so that you're kind of replacing that with what you're talking about.
And I think likewise for like the math problem and problems in general, especially I notice a lot of math problems, they're worded not great. And a lot of our kids are sticklers for like making sure that the wording of a question is, I've seen how many of those memes of like, put these words in alphabetical order, and the kids spell the word that, and they're putting each letter in alphabetical order rather than like the whole list. They're reading it very concretely. So sometimes like I've told kids like, they didn't write that question very well. Like, here's what it's trying to ask, and I'll rewrite the final question for them. And then that like, oh, how many apples are in total? Like, oh, okay, now I get it, because they understand the word total versus the word each. So I think acknowledging sometimes in written things like, that's not a good question, here's what they're trying to ask, and rewriting it is an okay and a good way to approach that situation.
Mm-hmm.
I think with anaphora too is, those words, that, it, this, right? Those are core words. And so there's this kind of new movement over the past couple of years that we should be teaching core words for kiddos who struggle more with language, rather than teaching them the word armadillo, because how functional is actually knowing the word armadillo? It's much more functional to know the word that, so that they can point, what is that? I want it. And so I think just making sure too, to verbally and in writing kind of use that core language across a lot of contexts, so that the kiddo is learning that these words have flexible meanings. They apply to a lot of different contexts, and that anytime I say the word it, I'm not only referring to a green armadillo, right? And so just kind of through modeling and natural communication, they'll kind of, and repetitiveness, they'll pick up the flexibility of it.
Yeah, so another example, it's not just one word in the sentence that refers to it. So if there's a sentence, a little story about a boy buying a book for his friend, And so the boy brings the book um, to her house, and who's her? Um, and so you go on and say, well, he brought it to her house, and he gave it to her, and she loved it. Well, it's filled with anaphora, which is the reference, the word for the references, and you can understand why it would be very confusing. How a sentence that has so many words that are not specific to the actual situation, and so as this is at the simple level, but at more complex stories, yeah. And then, yes, and then so we then say, okay, he brought the book to the girl's house, or whatever her name, and he is the boy, and so we would show them.
Or however specific you need to be, you can really be changing this.
Yeah.
And I like to use different colors because I think it really reinforces kind of the substitution of these words, and the new thing that we're doing.
Yeah. So all that goes into helping kids comprehend better.
Absolutely. Similar, moving on, sorry. A question we got about is, how can I get my child interested in fiction? Is it important to steer away from nonfiction? Two parts.
Okay. So a lot of our kids know a lot about lots of different subjects: planets, black holes, um, trains, NASCAR, and their drivers. They can learn lots and lots of facts about things, and they love the facts. We have kids that memorize um, the table of elements, and knew what atomic numbers and atomic weights meant and all that. But but they often have difficulty with, and maybe don't like very much, the fiction stories. So we try to start with fiction stories, and the kids' literature is filled with fiction stories that have animals as characters, and so they're anthropomorphized animals. And while I love Elephant and Piggy and all those books, Frog and Toad, and wonderful, many of the kids really have some difficulty with that. So I like using at first books like Henry and Mudge, which are about could be real. It's fiction, but it could be real. And so that is one of the things that we think about. But I remember I was telling Ciara about a blog, that early blog that one of the adults wrote years ago, and he said, I never understood fiction. I don't know why I have to read about a person, Sally, that is nothing like the person that I know, and it takes place in a fictional place. And I don't care about a fictional place. I want to know about real things. I want to know about real people. And he said, I don't understand why so much of school is reading literature and fantasy and all that. Although, some of the kids really like that, and they get into Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and all that. But many of them don't really see the point of reading fiction.
I think that the point really is that a lot of times nonfiction books don't really address, those social nuances or relationships or kind of problem solving things. And so it is helpful if we can find a fiction book or series that our kiddos can get involved with, because oftentimes they're written to teach a lesson or they're written to send a message. I actually have a lot of Aesop's Fables books that I read as a kid, but I love reading them because it's all about the moral and learning this social rule like sharing or taking turns or anything like that. And so it is hard, I understand, because kids, will get stuck in, hey, a dog can't talk. But just trying to reframe it and just know that the lesson might be more than just decoding and answering who, what, where, when, why. And I think something that I like to do is kind of interest chaining. And so if our kiddos are, preoccupied with trains or really into geography, then you can find fiction books that are tied to that. So my trains, of course, we go to Thomas the Train. I feel like I have that whole series memorized at this point. But there's other books that you can focus on that are just fictional, but still have something to do with their nonfiction passion.
Yeah.
Yes. So the point is, and that the point is well taken, that because the kids have difficulty very often understanding the social nuances of another person, the books can be very instructive in helping them understand that. But it's not the thing that they love to do the best, I think. So, but yes, so I think that we do need to present fiction, but we need to very carefully choose the kind of fiction depending on each individual child's interests and also the kinds of characters that are either easily translated into what human might do, even though they're animals, or that are built on human relationships. And as the kids get older, there are more books that talk about things that may be relevant to their lives and might help them understand what friendship is and how they should act in certain situations. The problem is that very often kids take those things literally, and I can think of a situation where one of our kids got into trouble because she used the script from Junie B. Jones, which is is an attempt at humor by the author, but our child took it literally, and so we have to be careful about that.
Yeah. Phyllis, did you want to, maybe we can go into our poem example and why on top of fiction, poetry might also be really great to introduce to our hyperlexic kiddos?
I'm sorry, tell me that, say that again.
Can we go into why fiction and poetry might also be a really
Oh,
good thing to
okay.
introduce to our kiddos?
Yes. Oh, poetry. That's all right. So yeah, I
good.
missed the word. Yeah. So one of the ways that we can try to help children understand that there are things in written books and stories and poems that are not stated. It's reading between the lines, and poetry is particularly good, particularly the short poems that make assumptions that you really understand what they're trying to say. They may use metaphors, they may use background knowledge, and so here's the Snowball by Shel Silverstein, that assumes that everybody knows about snowballs, right? But a child living in Florida or in a very hot climate may never have seen snow and maybe have never made a snowball. And so then we first have to build a schema for snowballs. So Ciara, you have some illustrations that can be used. So, okay,
Yeah.
that's a snowball.
So I think we were kind of just brainstorming how to build that schema. And so I'm going to be kind of going through this hierarchy that Phyllis put together. And right now we are working on kind of these first 4 things. So we've been given a new text, and now we need to build schema and create background knowledge. And so what I usually do with a lot of my kiddos is we'll just go to Google. And I love Google Images. I use it almost every day. And so just quickly, and here we go. There's a lot of different pictures on what a snowball is. And so what I've done is I've just opened up Paint. So you can do this via teletherapy online. You can do this on a piece of paper. You can do this on a whiteboard. I've posed the question. I've written it out. What is a snowball? I've written a closed sentence prompt here in red. A snowball is. And now there's a ton of different ways to answer this. A snowball is a ball of snow. But it's so much more. And so as we're building this background knowledge, you can start to use word maps. I just quickly pulled one up somewhere here. So this is just an example. I would put snowball in the middle, and then you could just look up associative words that might go along with it. And I think the first couple times you're obviously going to be leading this, right? But then just allow your kiddo to say, oh, snowball, snowman. They might come up with some really creative things that will provide a lot of insight to how they're building and connecting these things in their brain. So build your vocabulary knowledge and your definition, and then you'd go back to your whiteboard and start to describe it. I'm using an APRA here. The ball of snow or the snowball is cold. The snowball is frozen, and just really describing it and then going back through the story. So I think a couple of things that we need to consider is, one, we might not always have the chance to pre-read all of the stories and possibly pull out all of the vocabulary words that our kiddos are not going to know. So I think it's okay to read through it once and then maybe see, if there's words in there that they don't know, and then you can build it, and then just make sure you're rereading it a second, third, fourth time to help really build that comprehension.
Mm-hmm. Which is why poems are good for this, because you can read it very easily a bunch of times.
Right.
Right. And so, yeah, so poetry lends itself well to this kind of thing. So, so you would probably do the same thing about a pet. Not all kids have pets, and may not really understand that a dog and a cat or a gerbil is a pet. And then, he let the snowball sleep with him, and you think you could let the snowball sleep with you. And I made it pajamas and a pillow for its head, and then last night it ran away. Can a snowball run away? And but first it wet the bed. Now you really need to understand about melting and why that, and also about bedwetting. So I suppose in order to get the humor from the story, but you could see that there's a lot of things that we can do with just the very short poem that has some hidden meanings.
Right. So going into these kind of steps down here is where you're doing the story summary now. I just quickly found online a really fun, I think fun, activity, and it's you can create, here we go, comics online. And so you might have them retell the comic, and there's pictures and characters and there's scenes that you can create. Unfortunately, since I did this quickly, I couldn't find any snow backgrounds, but I'm sure you could make one. And then talk about what happened with the snowball. It melted, it got hot. I love being able to do this, and a lot of my students really love being able to do this, is adding their own text. I got hot, I melted, or it got hot, or did it run away? Like, you can add your own text and let the kiddo kind of express what they feel that they would be expressing. This story that they're recreating to continue to reinforce context might not even be specifically this story retell, but they might start to talk about something else that was melting. And that's okay, because they're building and expressing that schema that they have. So I like this for that. We get a lot of questions about guided writing. And so if you're retelling the story, you might put on here the or I don't even remember what the poem was off the top of my head. So for the guided writing, you could say, first, I made a snowball. And then and you're not filling in, you might have your student fill this in based on how, or your child, based on how they're doing, you might remove a lot more of that information and only start with first and leave the rest blank and see if they can just fill out that kind of schedule. It's going to be based on his understanding of it, his language ability level. You can really scaffold it and modify it as needed. And as he grows and progresses, you're going to want to slowly give him less and less supports for that guided writing. And then at the end, you can create a summary statement for like, a snowball can't run. And so you're kind of rewriting, but also reinforcing the concepts and the humor and describing it in another way that might be better understood by our students.
And then, you can go on to say, do you think a snowball would be a good pet? Or what would be a good pet? And why would we have a pet? So that very simple thing could really spawn a lot of conversation, a lot of writing, a lot of activities that support the comprehension of a basically pretty simple poem.
I think, yeah, no, I think if you think of guided writing almost as Mad Libs, but without the jokester and funniness, even in Mad Libs, they'll put in there, like put a descriptive word for a noun or a place or something. That's also kind of helpful based on the level of support that your student needs. You can almost rewrite it like Mad Libs, leaving out those blanks for your child to try and substitute in.
Yeah, I think so. One of the questions we got, we've addressed a piece of it. So it was, what type of comprehension questions can our Hyperlexia kids answer after the guided reading? Do they just do who, what, where, when, or why? I think we touched base on there's not like a specific type of question, but with some of those higher level things such as comparing and contrasting, distinguishing between opinion and fact, noting main idea. Ciara, do you think you could go into some of the examples of like how you can use some like Venn diagrams or other visuals to kind of help with those higher, more complex analytical questions?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I'll let Phyllis jump in, because when we were discussing how we would answer this, we talked a lot about the main ideas and inferencing. So I usually like to start with talking about keywords. And this is a concept that I'll bring up across really all of my therapy. And it's just figuring out what are the important words. I really like, when I'm focusing on main idea at a very small pattern scripted level, usually at a small passage, is finding the keywords. If there's repetitive keywords, that might be a main idea or a main focus of the passage. I like to talk about what a topic sentence is, or the first sentence, and see what that is. But again, you have to have kind of passages that were written for the purpose of finding the main idea. But I think it's important to start there so that you're framing the context and the concept of what a main idea is. Phyllis, you kind of went into creating patterns and templates for this, and then you brought up the very good or meaningful concept that not all passages or paragraphs or stories have familiar and consistent keywords or things like that. So how would you work on bringing up that main idea?
Well, so yeah, there's in looking back at a paragraph and trying to find the keywords and finding that's good, except that you're right that some of the paragraphs really don't have a keyword to glom onto and say. And anyway, in a sense, going back and looking at the paragraph, my experience is that kids pick out the words that they like, or they pick out the words that are used often in that paragraph, and they may miss that those are details and not the main idea. And so so I think that, again, using a sort of a retelling kind of sentence all right, so what is happening in this paragraph, or what uh, let's summarize the paragraph, and then you need to guide them into figuring out what is the purpose of this paragraph in the first place. Is it just describing the setting of the, describing, it may not have to do with the action of the story. It may be a setting of the story, or it may be a description of the person's looks, or it may be the action that's going on, but it's not the main idea. So we have to kind of adjust, adjust first to the kind of paragraph it is, but also to the child that is sitting before us, and what we expect, or what we think that child really understands from all this. And so I think if you take anything away from what we're saying today, it's that each situation is different, which makes the reading comprehension not just a one single context. It is generally, we have to take into account the child, and what the child knows, and what they're interested in, and what they can take from that. It's a very complex kind of interaction when we're talking about helping the child understand what they're reading.
Yeah. Something that I recommend too is to read below their decoding level. So just because your student can read at, a 6th, 7th, 8th grade high school reading level, in order to work on the language comprehension piece, maybe work at a text that's a lower level or an easier level for them to decode, so that they can really focus on synthesizing the details, understanding the main idea, and focusing on more of that comprehension piece. It's okay to do that.
Yeah, and I think you can especially go back and do something simpler when you're going to go and practice a new kind of comprehension strategy. So, like, if you haven't worked on, comparing and contrasting before, it would be good to go back to a simpler text, or a really familiar topic, to introduce that concept before you're doing it with a whole new novel material. So if one of their favorite interests is elements or trains or whatever, maybe you're starting with comparing and contrasting these known items before you're comparing and contrasting characters in the story that you're reading. So just kind of using a lower level thing to kind of practice that concept before you're introducing it to the current reading material.
Yeah, so to address the Venn diagram thing that I didn't get to, and just to address some of the school questions we didn't get to, another thing that you can put into IEPs or ad supports is making sure that they have access and use to graphic organizers. Graphic organizers cover really everything, including story maps, including vocabulary maps, including Venn diagrams, including plot points, and being able to sequence out a story. So make sure that they have the ability to use graphic organizers and the opportunity to learn how to use them.
Mm-hmm. So very often, because I love Elephant and Piggy, even though they're anthropomorphized characters, very often we have kids that are 3 and 4 and 5 who are reading at the 3rd, 4th, 5th grade levels, decoding. But what they may not understand is the relationship between the two friends. And so when we read Pigs Make Me Sneeze, where Gerald the elephant comes in sneezing, and he thinks that his friend Piggy he's allergic to that. So we have to talk about what an allergy is. And then, he's sneezing, and he finally figures out that if he goes to the cat doctor, and the doctor says that he has a cold, and he comes back thrilled that he's sick. He's really sick. And this is the opposite of what our kids really experience. They're not thrilled to be sick, but why would Gerald be thrilled. And so it's a really higher level context that the author assumes that most kids understand the difference between an allergy and being sick, and then why he's been sneezing all over. I mean, this is COVID, so we have to know about this, I suppose. He's been sneezing all over Piggy, and of course, when he comes back elated that he's sick, you know, she has caught his cold already. And so why isn't she so happy that he's sick? And you know, so that the social part of it is the element of the story. The words in the story are basic and simple, and it's mostly achoo. And so so there's a lot they can get from Pete the cat, and also Henry and Mudge, which are more accessible. So it's finding a relationship between understanding the words, which and the sentences and the main idea and the context, and also understanding the social parts of it. And here I see that Corinne has joined us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Corinne. I think some of you have been on before and heard me. I'm the executive director at Chat Now, shepherding Phyllis's extraordinary legacy. And I just want to thank everybody, our presenters and our moderator, and everybody who joined. And just say, you know, there is so much. We know that there are so many questions. There are so many tips. And we're a resource for you. This isn't it. If we didn't get to your question today, you know how to reach us, and we will be holding more of these webinars. And I also just want to mention, you know, that the Hyperlexia focus of Chat is a part of its very long legacy from 1979 as CSLD into the 80s when Phyllis started her Hyperlexia focus, and the idea of being a place for those with few, if any, other options. And today, that's pretty much everybody. And so, you know, as people used to have lots of different choices and now they just don't have those choices, we have really focused on the families that can't get help anywhere else. So whether it's because we have expertise in an area that's unusual, or because we will take Medicaid or provide scholarships to help families that can't get support anywhere else. If you know anybody that needs help, please send them our way. That is what we are here to do. And thank you for all that you do for your kids.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.